Hello, everyone. Welcome to our webinar. We'll give a few moments here for folks to join, and then we'll get started. Okay, welcome everyone. I'm Marius Moscovici. Welcome so much. We're very happy to have you here joining us today for the top 7 lies we tell ourselves about data governance. And today I'm, advance the slides. Today I am happy to be joined by Laura Madsen. Laura is an accomplished author and speaker. She often keynotes many data governance presentations internationally. She has written a terrific book called Disrupting Data Governance. If you have not read it, I highly recommend it. It's one of these very rare finds, a data governance book that is really interesting and fun to read and not boring. So kudos to you, Laura, for doing that. Anyone that sort of needs a general primer or ideas around data governance, I recommend you take a look at that. Just to let you know, kind of a few things from a housekeeping perspective. The lines are going to be muted. We have quite a few folks on the calls here, but you can put your questions in our Q&A window, and we will do our best to just integrate that into our discussion. If we don't get to your question, we will follow up with you afterwards to get your response. And we will have recordings sent out after the webinar, and there will also be a drawing at the end of afterwards with folks that have attended the full session. Someone will have an opportunity to win Laura's book in a giveaway. So with that, I welcome Laura. Thank you for joining us.
Hello, thank you for having me. I'm excited to talk about the lies.
Yes, yes. And I think today our goal when we talk about this is hopefully to, make it interesting for folks, but really also to, not just talk about these lies that we tell ourselves and why they're not true, but hopefully to give you also some, concrete ideas of what do you do to combat this, because I think it's all about sort of having, making things work, right? It's all about disrupting the status quo so that things work, as you always say. So why don't we get started, and why don't you kick things off with your thoughts about this?
Yes, data governance is expensive. That picture is of me like 10 years ago, right? And I think this is the part about lies, quote unquote lies, right? Is that there's probably some truth to them. And I think there probably are scenarios in which somebody thinks data governance is really expensive, particularly in those situations where, you get super excited, you kick off data governance, and then you run out and buy a bunch of tools, and then you're trying to figure out what the heck to do with all the tools. And then somebody taps you on the shoulder and says, we bought all those tools and I'm not seeing any value yet. Seems kind of expensive. What's going on? So I guess maybe the truth behind this lie, right, is that there's probably a scenario in which sometimes it is expensive, but maybe shouldn't be, I guess. So if it's really expensive for you, maybe that isn't necessarily somebody else's problem.
Well, I guess the question too is when you think about expensive relative to what, right? Because sure. the fact is that everything in around IT and BI data is at an absolute level expensive.
Yeah.
But it's as you said, I think it's a function of value. And the fundamental question is what kind of value, and we're going to talk about that I think a little more later. But if you're looking at things, and also I think the reason that I like this one when you brought it up, and I think it's really true, is that people use expensive oftentimes like an excuse, right? Like, okay, well, if I'm going to do data governance, I need to get all these tools, and I need to, get a big staff, and I need to do this, and that's such a big budget item, and so we're not going to really do this because it's just too expensive. And that I think is where the poison is behind this, telling yourself this, because one of my favorite philosophers back in college, I remember I took this Asian philosophy class, and there was this the Taoist philosopher, person who started Taoism, Lao Tzu. And I remember one of the things that he said was that I think it was a journey of 10,000 miles begins with one step.
Oh, sure.
That's
yeah.
a famous quote, thousands of years ago. So the
Right.
point being is like, yes, it's a 10,000 mile journey, but you take one step. And so the thing to me about the expensive is, sure, you can spend a lot of money, but like the real question is, how do you take whatever resources you have at your disposal and take that first step, right? And make that work. I mean, right? That's
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I think that's absolutely true. I think the one thing that, for organizations that are starting this, like, that don't run off and buy a tool. That's the lesson, right? Figure out what you're doing first, take a beat, identify some of the value, determine what those metrics are that is really going to drive some of the truly represent the value back to the organization. Do a couple of iterations on that before you really run out and buy a bunch of products that you're not even sure what problem you're trying to solve for yet. I think that's probably the one big one. And, I mean, yeah, expensive is relative, but I also think that you can do a lot of this work without a team of 300, 400, or 500 people, which is really what you would need if you did it, if you're truly thinking about it the old traditional way of having data stewards for every domain that's critical in a petabyte, data repository. It's just crazy. Much modern data governance functions need to operate in a much more responsive and resilient way.
So Laura, when you think about, I mean, you do a lot of work with all these, different companies, and you see a lot of, different ways that people structure their governance initiatives, and you've seen things that are effective, and where I'm sure you're going, oh wow, there's a lot of waste here, but other places where you're going, it seems like it's really, they're spending their money in really smart ways, right? Mm-hmm. Can you share what do you see as the best way to make it not less expensive, but generating the value for the money that's being spent? What are the characteristics of those organizations where they seem to really get this part right?
Yeah, it's really understanding the scope of the function. Like, what are you going to do with data governance, and understanding what value that provides to your organization, and defining that really well from the get-go, and then backing into what metrics may sort of defend that, if you will, right? But don't start with the metrics first, like, and because you can make up a lot of metrics. I really think it's about, what is data governance doing for your organization? What is that scope? What is the budget? What are the resources? And then representing those metrics from there. And then when you do that, you really understand the intent of any tool that you would want to bring on board. And then you can stand that tool up, and it actually it might provide value for you. But if you don't really know, and you bring that tool on, and then you're just kind of trying to figure out how to implement a tool, or, that's probably not going to get you where you want to go.
So kind of like a begin with the end in mind, kind of as
absolutely
principle there, right?
Absolutely.
Oh, cool. All right, good. Well, let's go to the second big lie that folks tell themselves, that you can do it in your free time. That must be you sitting at the beach now, right?
I probably would be at the beach fully clothed, to be honest with you, because I don't roll that way, but it wouldn't be a laptop in hand. It would be probably a book.
Bad sand is bad for your laptop.
Yeah, right. Yeah, you can do it in your free time. How many times have we, interacted with organizations that put a data steward, like, I'm a full-time analyst, right? And I probably work 55 hours a week, and now I'm going to be a data steward, right? And, I think that is really, really problematic, for the same reasons as, standing up a bunch of tools when you don't really know what you're doing yet, thinking that you can execute this effort with any kind of consistency and thoroughness, with some free time is probably, well, not probably, it will end in, disaster.
Yeah, I mean, it's almost like this, it seems like this is more, if anything, this is sort of symptomatic of kind of a situation where, senior management doesn't want, they're like, okay, we need to have data governance, it's important. I've heard about that, and my board talks about it, and there's compliance issues that I make sure I address, but I don't want to allocate a lot of resources to this. So let me just kind of pick a bunch of analysts out there and ask them to do it in their extra time that they have available, right? And kind of like sort of do it on the cheap. Is sort of the thing, right? And that's what tends to cause this kind of phenomena where if it's not properly, the initiative is just not properly resourced because it's not a priority, right?
Right.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's probably true. And that's generally when it's not a priority, then they throw it on, like whoever happens to have some quote unquote free time, but nobody does. That's a misnomer, right?
Yeah, there's no such
Mhm.
thing. I think I was thinking about this, I was thinking about kind of how sometimes what we see in environments where governance isn't really particularly working very well, like what's kind of an analogy for that? And it occurred to me that it's very much like, I don't know if for me, like I have 3 kids, right? And I've watched them, all of them kind of have this encounter with brushing their teeth, right? Where they're like, I don't know if you those of us that have kids, anyone who has kids on this call, I think I appreciate this. When your kids first brush their teeth, they're like, okay, you tell them they have to brush their teeth before bed and they have to brush their teeth in the morning before they eat their breakfast. And so like, okay, well, I'm gonna, so you give them toothbrush and they just go, like this, and we're done, right? Like just a zip, because they say, okay, brush your teeth. And it's really hard to get them to do it, to dedicate the necessary time to it, not just do it like, oh, lecture, because they don't like connect the fact that they're brushing their teeth. What they're doing now is going to have like impact 6 months down the line, right? And that there's a consequence associated to it, like,
Right.
and I think that there's a similar sort of, sometimes this lie can be such a problematic thing, because it can cause people to try to do data governance in this way, try to do it in this like, okay, let me create a glossary of definitions really quickly, come up with some way to do certification some really easy way, but like not really thoughtfully, not really mindfully, not really with the end in mind, like you said, like I'm doing it in order to generate proper demo hygiene, right? So and then as a result, it's really almost like you're not doing anything, right? Just doing it, trying to do it in your free time is almost like it's worse than doing a half-ass is worse than not doing it at all, right?
It's sort of that, I stayed at a Holiday Inn Express last night, so therefore I'm fill in the blank. I had a boss tell me once many years ago. He's like, well, I went to the doctor last week, so I'm a healthcare expert. I was like, yeah, sure, okay. So yeah, I just think that there's a lot to be said for trying to shove it into somebody else's role, right? And that's you can do it in your free time kind of concept. And we have a couple of questions on this. There's one that asking is there an industry standard to have the data stewardship function performed from existing roles, or do companies have dedicated roles? And so I don't know about you, Marius. I've certainly seen, to me, the more frequent thing is that they don't have dedicated roles necessarily, right? They do ask people to fill this role as part of another job, or they give them some free time to do it. But there are some folks that, or some organizations, I should say, that have job families dedicated to both data stewardship and data ownership. So I think it probably has more to do with the organization and how seriously they take data governance than the industry standard per se.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. I think you basically answered. I would agree with that. That's just a general standard, and there are many ways to do things, but I think that's a good way. Just one thing I noticed is this question, and maybe it's worth just touching base on this. I don't think you could have a whole webinar just on this question, but just if you had to succinctly define what constitutes good governance. Right. What would you say would be the things that would fall into that?
Yeah. That's a good question. So there's a lot of definitions out about what data governance is, and as a result, you could take those definitions and break them down, and that's how you define good governance. I happen to think about data governance in 4 categories that are operational, so that it allows you to look at those categories and determine how well you're doing on any given category. So the first category is usage. So really the whole point is we're increasing usage of the data asset, because otherwise what the heck are we doing, right? collecting a paycheck and filling up a seat or something. But the whole point is improving the usage of the data. The second one is data quality. There is no data governance without data quality. There is no data quality without data governance. I get a lot of pushback on that one, which I find fascinating. But, there's that famous quote that says, you can't manage what you don't measure. Well, there's a flip side to that too, which is you can't measure what you don't manage, right? If you want to have a metric that's very important to your organization, but you're not managing the data behind it, good luck. Good luck. That should be fun. So those are the first two. The third one is a data lineage, which is the provenance of the data, right? From where it originates all the way to the target, and kind of everything that happens in between time, because that leads to a lot of questions about the data and whether or not it's of high quality, how you define it, all those things. And lineage is really important from our end users, believe it or not. Most end users don't think about lineage the way that data professionals do, but for data professionals, or I'm sorry, from a business stakeholders perspective, data lineage is two things: where they enter the data in the front end and where they saw a report on the back end. So we really have to fill that gap. So that's number 3 is data lineage. And then the fourth one is protection, which is what data governance used to be almost exclusively defined as, which is protecting those assets. And I actually think it's one of those 4 categories that all together make excellent data governance functions.
That's a great definition. And from my perspective, I wouldn't add anything to that except to say that, from our perspective, we're interested a lot in governance as it relates to the end user and the consumer, kind of what Laura's talking about, and then extending, governance practices all the way into the BI stack and the technologies that are part of that. And so I think that's very important to kind of achieve really high degree of value from your governance initiatives. But I think that covers up. So let's move on, because we've got quite a few more to cover. So this is I think a common misconception, right? Data governance is not a value add. It's all about sort of, I guess, compliance and regulation, and meeting what we need to from a requirements perspective. So what are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, I think this is a really tough one, because for a long time, data governance was not a value add. But there's no question. Like, if we think about data governance in most of the 2000s, certainly in the whatever decade we're in now, which I completely lost track of, it wasn't a value add. We would use this sort of fear mongering, if you don't do data governance, regulatory audits, blah, blah, blah. And so it wasn't a value add, it was a checkbox activity. We felt like we had to prove to somebody that we were doing something in this data governance space. Fast forward to whatever the heck the year is. I think the reality here is we have tools that can really provide a lot of value to the organization. We can start to create frameworks that would ease the use of data, which is something that really a lot of organizations struggle with, right? We have created these giant data literacy programs in our organizations, which are critically important so we can ask better questions about our data. On the flip side of that, what has happened is there's a whole bunch of questions about the data. And, without data governance, we struggle to be able to answer those questions about how we define them, what the provenance of the data is, what happens to that data over time. And so the data literacy program sort of became a bellwether for data governance. And if you do those things well, in balance, then, the great thing about that is you actually speed up the usage of that data, and particularly this concept of certified data that's been defined and has high quality, meets high quality standards. So you really have the ability to sort of speed up the use of that data. And as people are using that data and asking really great questions about it, you actually get really good about the data quality, because people are using it, they're asking questions. When there's eyeballs on it, right? Data quality generally improves if you take that feedback back in and start to take the steps to improve your data quality. So I do think that data governance, while probably for a good chunk of its time as it existed, didn't have a lot of value add to it. It certainly does now when you start to think about all of the usage, quality, lineage, and protection concepts that we can apply.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think to some extent, this perception, which I think is very pervasive and oftentimes in the senior executive levels. I mean, there was, I think, an earlier question here about how do you justify leadership expense on the ROI, and this really feeds into this value question, I think, because so this is kind of a test you can run for yourself, right? To see how you exactly feel about data governance. If you next time there's like a company meeting, right? If you walk up to one of your, somebody, a senior leader in your organization, and you're involved in your data governance field, and just try this out, start talking to them about what data governance is all about, right? Just cocktail conversation. And I bet you within if you start talking about, here's all the different things we're doing, we're doing glossary, working on lineage, working on certification of data sets, et cetera. So if you talk about the mechanisms, if you talk about all those pieces to it, within a minute tops, those eyes are just gonna glaze right over, and they'll be like looking for an excuse to kind of, excuse themselves, right? Because they just, that is not from a communication perspective. I think we do ourselves a disservice if that's how we're talking about it, right? We need to focus, like what you just said, Laura, we need to focus on the value. We communicate, what is it that we're contributing to the organization? And part of that, I think, is having a willingness to measure the value and be accountable to some value. So if your goal in data governance is to increase usage, right, then the question becomes, well, how are you going to do that? First, have you benchmarked, right, that level to know, okay, this is where we are before we started this new initiative, and then are you willing to kind of measure it at the end of the process, and then show the ROI in some tangible way? And ROI doesn't have to be we saved a gazillion dollars. It doesn't have to be like that. It can be we increased engagement with our analytics from this level to this other level. Hey, we surveyed our users, and they originally, 30% of them were not using analytics at all, or X percentage of them were saying that they have a very negative perception, that they don't know what data they can trust, they don't know how to engage with it. And then after we roll out this project, here's the ratings. We bumped that metric up by this particular percentage. So, it's not a value add. The way to kind of bust that lie, if you like, is to show that it's a value add. But I think that takes a huge amount of a kind of accountability and a little bit of risk taking from the folks of us who are doing this.
Right. Yeah, I think that's very true. It is one of those weird things, right? But the function of data governance is to, improve essentially the value of our data, although we've struggled to do that. But we have a difficult time proving that into a metric. Creating that baseline and showing that improvement over time is often a really challenging thing. And I saw a comment come through here about ROI is nearly impossible to prove, and I think that's true. It is very difficult, and that kind of leads back to the question, the first lie about it being expensive. ROI is very difficult to prove, and particularly if you run out and buy a bunch of stuff and then you can't prove the value of that stuff, right? Then you're back on your heels right away. The best advice I've often heard is, well, tie it to a business project. But again, to your point, Marius, I think we really struggle with talking to people in our organizations about what data governance really is. And we've often used that stick of regulation or privacy or security as, well, you have to do this, it's the cost of doing business, and that's probably true, but that doesn't mean that we can't do a lot of great things to really improve the reputation of governance and to show that there's a lot of value add that exists there, because it is so much more than just those regulatory things, the protection and privacy.
Yeah, I think that's right. And so let's go on, because we've got more to cover. So what about this slide that we often hear, that data governance is just about the data?
Oh, this was my favorite one. I will talk to a lot of people about, a lot of people will call me and be like, I want to get into data governance and I want to be a data governance leader. And I just, Laura, could you please give me your opinion? And I was like, sure. Pick another different job. I don't know, do something else. And so my question is, well, do you like to analyze data? And they're like, oh yeah, I love it. And I'm like, okay, well then pick a different job. No, seriously, because the thing is about data governance as a leadership function is that as the data governance leader, your primary job is about communicating, building bridges, creating alignment, right? It is not about analyzing the data. It is not about knowing where the data bodies are buried. There are people that exist in data governance, like the stewards, that their primary job is probably about the data, rolling up the sleeves and banging against it all day long, right? But as the data leader, that is not your job. That is not your function. And, focusing on that instead of that strategy, the roadmap, the value add, the communicating, all of that will probably lead you down a garden path. It'll be really frustrating for you. So generally in this particular when I get this question, I'm like, well, if you really, really like the data part of it, then data governance probably is not for you. On the flip side of that, it's one of the reasons why data governance drives me bananas as a practitioner. Like, I don't want to talk about it. I just want to do something. So it is one of the reasons why I find data governance so challenging, is because of the level of communication that it takes, and that has very little to do with the data itself.
Yeah, I think that's right. I couldn't agree with you more. I find that that's one of the biggest sort of things that stand in people's ways, that they, the people that want to do data governance are usually the data wonks, and oftentimes those people just want to be with it. Leave me alone, my data here, and I'll just do my thing. Don't try to talk to me, right? Whereas it is a team sport, right? It requires that having a degree of collaboration. It requires the process thinking. It requires all these different skills. So I guess the question, what do you think when you look at the flip side of, the person you said loves the data is not the right person? What are the kinds of skills you think are absolutely critical for somebody to be successful in that role?
Yeah, well, it's nice if you have some framework for data, like maybe you've done something in that space at one point or another. But my number one hiring criteria is enthusiasm. Because the reality of this work is it's really hard. It's a big old slog, right? There are no big milestones. There's not this big moment where everybody can have a big party and say, we did it, yay, data governance, right? It's this day after day, pounding the pavement, creating those relationships, talking about the function. And so really, for me, enthusiasm about the work and how important data governance is to organizations is critically important. I can probably teach you almost everything else, but that's probably one of the big ones.
Okay, so the next one is that data governance is an IT function.
I love this picture.
Yeah, exactly. How many of us have felt this way?
Oh man, I tell you, yeah. Well, it's not, right? It's data governance is definitely not an IT function, and this is one of those areas where how often do we answer the question, does the data team reside in IT or does it reside in business? In the data governance side, we get these questions: is it top down or is it bottom up? And the truth is it's none of those things. It's all of those things. But IT often gets saddled with data governance as a function because they are closest to the data. And this poor gentleman is, literally close to the data, at least in that bits and bytes form. And then there's a lot of people that want to sort of wash their hands of it, like, in a traditional organization, your salespeople, right? Well, data's not my job, as they're hammering away at their, CRM product. That is their job, right? So much of their job is hand entering data in a CRM. But the challenge is that most people don't really understand that data is part of their job, and it's part and parcel to their job. And they are the ones that are driving data quality challenges in the organization. So what do you do about it? Well, that's about the communication, right? About having those conversations with people, helping them understand that data is actually their job. They're doing it all the time. They're the ones that are driving the data quality errors. And that's one of the reasons why I feel like lineage is so important, to help business people understand that black box that happens in between the front end when they're entering something into like a CRM system, and then the back end when they see something in a report, and then they look at it and be like, oh, the report's wrong. Well, it's probably doing exactly what we designed it to do. But the fact that you enter in 1, 2, 3 Mockingbird Lane in 7 different ways every time you do it might be part of the problem.
Right. And I think it's that delay, right? That we as human beings are just not that good at like,
Right.
we may take an action and it has this negative consequence. If it has a negative consequence right away, then you see it. But if it's like, okay, wow, this practice I'm having today, like go back to the hygiene situation, right? If you have bad dental hygiene, you don't notice it immediately. It's just some number of months later, your gums start bleeding, you have bad breath and all, you have cavities, right? So it's like, it's that same thing as it's generating that awareness around what are the activities that the people are doing that are basically counterproductive, what activities are working, and how does it really actually tie to things that people really care about and making it applicable. But then I think the fact that it's not IT function also speaks to the fact it is it is a team sport, right? It's not,
Right.
those of us who are watching Olympics, right? It's not individual figure skating. It's more like hockey or whatever, right? It's more like this guy, you might be the goalie as the data governance lead or have you, but you need that whole team around you that each has their roles to make everything work. And so I think it goes back to what you were saying before, Laura. You've got to see the role that you have as much more than about putting together a program and executing the program, but really about how do you generate buy-in within the organization. This is where really people skills become very important, and the ability to just communicate broadly and communicate repeatedly and communicate the right things that people are going to be able to hear and understand is very important. And I think it also stems back to, I think there's a bunch of questions here around the metrics. I think it is important to measure the things that you want to improve, as you said, right? And it is not necessarily so difficult to do. Sure, you're not going to generate revenue impact or cost savings directly from, that's hard to attribute. But you can certainly, if the goal is to generate higher engagement, you could certainly baseline engagement by looking at, how many people are using the analytics that you're being created and how much did you change. Or if it's data literacy, you can baseline that with a survey. Anyone can generate a Survey Monkey survey and send it out, and ask a set of questions, baseline it, and do it 6 months later. So why do people not do it? Because first of all, it's extra work, right? And people are just generally want to let me get back to my data and my process of things that are comfortable. But I think it's also that there's risk. It feels risky, right? I think that there's a certain amount of like, hey, if I benchmark these metrics, then I apply my data governance program, and 6 months later those numbers haven't moved. There's a lot of visibility around the fact that what I've done has not worked, right? So there's a certain amount of like, it feels safer not to measure those things, to keep it as a back office thing and to do it. And I think that, if I would say to those folks on the webinar today, if you are, if you're all about really making things happen within your organization, if you're passionate about having data governance be a disruptive function that actually adds value, then, you've got to take some risks and, declare some goals around key metrics, baseline it, get out of your shell and communicate with folks and then measure and see how whatever you're doing is working or not, and then iterate, right? That's fine.
Yeah. And iteration is critical. There's no such thing as perfect, and starting somewhere and then getting, that good, better, best is always great. Great way to think about it. So I did see one come through here where it says, I've participated in lots of governance functions, and IT is always, in there in the mix. And I agree. The fact of the matter is it isn't a business or an IT, it's a together thing. You have to have both, but business has to be at the table, otherwise you're not going to be successful. So
yeah, it's not just an IT function, I guess.
Yeah, exactly. It is not.
It's a combination, and the broader buy-in you have across the organization, the more likely you are to actually have some success. Right? That's the other key thing.
Yeah.
Okay. So one more here. We have just data governance is really just for those folks that don't really know the data. If you're an analyst, you know the data. Why do you really need it? Right? You don't need data governance.
Sorry, this one makes me laugh. Yeah, because you're applying your own data governance live, right? Like, you're an analyst, you're banging against the data, and you're applying your own version of data governance as you're doing it. Yeah.
Why do you need it?
Yeah. Why do we do that? Well, we shouldn't, obviously. And I think the reality is, so how is this phrased? Analysts that know the data don't need data governance. So on a one-off scenario, that's probably true, right? I mean, in many respects, analysts that have a good contextual understanding of the data, they're applying their own version of it. But, outside of an N of one, that's not really helpful, is it? If you want to just bang against your data all day long, that's fine. But if you have 2,000 users that have to use it and everybody's applying their own version of data governance, you just created yourself a big old mess. So just one person's version of the truth is really not that helpful. And I see in the comments that there's a kind of conversation going on about single source of truth. And I think that's one of the biggest lies in data that has ever existed, is the single source of truth. It stop chasing it. It doesn't exist. There is no single source of truth. There's certainly a single source of record. There's a single source of origination. But as data governance tries to chase down that single source of truth, we'll just absolutely hang ourselves, because everybody's version of it is different. What matters is that you create some kind of shared perspective of it where it matters, where you're using data to compare. And if you are just one person, applying your own data governance, that has no value to the organization, which is essentially what we used to do with chasing this concept of single source of truth, this one standard definition of something, a definition of a customer, if you will. And we had to use that one definition of a customer. Well, okay, that's great, except that it doesn't apply to everybody. My favorite example is in healthcare. You don't want your nurse manager to have the same definition as a finance manager of patient. But if they're comparing across entities, across units, across departments, across campuses, the number of patients that we had last week, that should be a shared concept. But there's you have to find a broader way of allowing people to use the data and then having a consistency around that sharing concept. But single source of truth just doesn't exist.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with that. I think it's asking the wrong question, right? Mm-hmm. It's not what is the right definition of customer, which implies there's only one, like you said. It's when I'm consuming this data, I'm looking at this report, it's a sales report, it has, how is customer defined in this context, right? And what are the other things that I'm looking at that have a similar definition of customer, so that when I'm comparing, or a particular number from this report to this other report, is the definition the same, or are we taking different contexts, so that way that promotes proper data literacy. I'm using that report or the dashboard, or if I'm an analyst, I'm using the data directly. I'm using the definition in a way that then is consistent across all the different use cases. And that's, that also sort of, to me, belies the point here, is that if you are an analyst, maybe you're not so much of a consumer of the definition. Maybe you should be a producer of that context, or maybe you're a tagger. Everyone has a role in this ecosystem, right? There's the let's come up with a set of definitions, and maybe there's 6 different definitions of what revenue means depending upon which group and how they're working on it. But let's map all that to all the content that's being consumed, so that anyone that's an end user that's looking at this understands, like what you were saying, Laura, the in and out. Right, the lineage, not from this comes from this table and this column, which maybe matters to the particular analyst, but from the perspective of, well, okay, which definition does this come from, right? Mm-hmm. Which source am I looking at? Is this does customer applies to retail or wholesale? Is it like you said? Is it a patient? Is it somebody who's pays the bill, or is it everybody? So I know what this customer count means, and I think if we look at that from that perspective, it changes the lens of how do we. Instead of how do we find the perfect definition, it's right. How do we come up with a set of definitions and then enable the consumption of that via the end consumer, so that then they can so those definitions generate value. So it doesn't become that because the other thing I see so often is around that whole process of coming up with the single source of truth, coming up with the definition. People will laboriously come up with these definitions, and then what do they do with them, right? They put them, they say, oh, I'm creating the data governance wiki, or the right, and here it is, and here's all the come, and you can look at the definitions, and nobody goes there and looks at it. So it's like that old saying, right? Tree falls in the forest and nobody's there. Right. It doesn't make any noise. Well, I don't know, but if you do a whole bunch of work on that kind of effort, and people don't know about it, then don't consume it, don't consume that, then it's not generating any value, right? So I think here it's that kind of question is, as a data, not only should you be heavily involved in data governance as an analyst in consuming all the government content that's available to you, leveraging the knowledge of other analysts, but you should be a producer of things that are then consumed by the end user to promote data literacy.
Yeah.
Okay, so this is the last one that we have on the list, and then we can kind of come back and see if there's any kind of questions that we didn't pick up and talk about. And the governance is all about generating policies and procedures.
Yep, just sit down and bury yourself in a pile of paper. Yeah, when I was like 9, I wanted to be a lawyer, and the only reason I wanted to be a lawyer is because I knew they read a lot and wrote a lot. I was like, oh, I can do that, right?
Yeah, we don't know about that.
Absolutely, I can do that. Turns out I suck at writing policies, though. So that's kind of important. Yeah, I mean, this is one of those, sort of hangovers from the old air quotes traditional way of thinking about data governance, which is the command and control. So, for a really long time in data governance, the function was primarily around writing those policies and procedures about the data, about like usage, essentially, right? And so for a really long time, data governance people were writing policies and procedures about that, and it's not what the function is about. That doesn't mean that policies and procedures aren't important. It just means that they happen to sit under the accountability of your, compliance team, your privacy team, whatever you call it, privacy, security, risk, compliance, that kind of a thing. So they write the policies, your InfoSec writes the procedures or supports the creation of the procedures so they can actually execute against them. And your job is, as you're reading those policies, to make sure that from a data governance professional perspective, you're implementing into the operational system anything that needs to be managed, right? So if there's a bunch of policies and procedures around, protected health information, you're doing all the things that you need in the back end to ensure that is actually operationalized that way. So there's just a shift in that the accountability for policies and procedures sits with somebody else. You have the responsibility to implement them, and that's a big one. Yeah.
And so I think it's all about that. Your point is, I think, and this is really well, I think it's all about the execution, right? It's not, don't worry about having the same, where you give an example with the customer, don't worry about having the perfect policy written out, it's about doing that. What do you think is, as far as making it, partnering up with those various stakeholder organizations and coming up with processes that can be executed off? Because oftentimes there's policies, procedures, but it's really actually hard for people. There's not a lot of adherence necessarily, right?
Yeah.
Some of the things. What do you think is the right way to kind of create a governance infrastructure where you can get actual adherence from the community that you're trying to follow?
Yeah, I call this the happy alliance. So if you're starting data governance from the beginning, if you are restarting data governance because it took a crapper and you're starting it over, you start with that happy alliance. So you go and you talk to your compliance professional, and this is dependent on industry, by the way. I think that what those departments are called is different in every industry slightly, but it's your compliance, your privacy, your risk, your InfoSec team, and you literally create an alliance. And from the very beginning, as they're writing those policies, you're sort of hand in hand during that creation to make sure that as they're writing things, you actually have the ability to execute those things. One of the things I do a lot as a consultant is read policies and procedures and tell those folks that there's no way that I could have ever operationalized what they're asking me to do. Right. And I serve as that bridge because somebody on the other side of that house, right, maybe in the data governance team, doesn't want to or has had difficulty talking to privacy, security, and compliance about what they've written and how they can actually execute against it. So that's why I think that happy alliance is so critically important. because you can't skip this part, right? As much as I'd love to say, oh, check the protection, nobody needs it. It's a modern world, right? It's not feasible. So the best thing that you can do is start from the beginning, create that happy alliance, have those conversations about the way policies are written and whether or not you can actually operationalize them. Have InfoSec as part of that, leading a lot of that conversation around that operationalization, because that's really what procedure should do. And then just kind of, keep iterating through until you get that really, really well designed. I will tell you that I've gotten more pushback from IT people than I've gotten from, and I use a very general terms, traditional IT people than I have from InfoSec or privacy, security, and compliance about that particular approach. And I think it's just kind of, well, we've tried that before and they never, they're just saying, well, that's the policy, which is probably true. At some point that probably did happen. But, certainly most CISOs these days and a lot of people that lead privacy these days really understand the challenge that's in front of them and are happy to partner to figure out how we can actually execute and implement these things appropriately.
So it's all about, what you're saying really there is it's all about having that, strong working relationship of trust.
Absolutely.
Right?
It's critical.
The folks writing the policies need to be able to trust that when IT is telling them or what was telling them this cannot be executed, that they're really not just being lazy, but they're not able to execute it. And vice versa, the people doing the execution have to try to be open-minded and go, okay, how can we implement these policies in such a way that
right.
Is there some way to be creative and do this? And it's always this, to me, it's always this really delicate balance where, and I think you write about this in your book, there's historically there's been a tendency around protection, right? Protect, which is very important, right? But how do we want to protect in a way that you are generating engagement and usage, and because if you protected that asset so much that nobody can actually come in and use it, what's the point, right? Like it's not like it's like great.
That's the first pillar of usage, right? Yep.
So I think I think that's it. And so it's like anything else. I mean, really, I think it's soft people skills there. Certainly having a process, but it sounds like it's not an easy. There's not a simple cut and dry answer. It's really.
Yeah, there really isn't. And we've all been at the receiving end of, policies that have been written that we couldn't execute on and difficult conversations and tough do it anyway kind of things. So it really is, it's about, it's just about creating that solid partnership so that you can move forward.
Yeah, and I think that to me, at least, we deal more of this on the BI side and then analytics coverage, but I think a lot of times we find that it's much more effective to have a capabilities discussion, right?
Sure.
With the folks generating the policy. And then when you do that, you say, well, here's the things that are possible to do. Okay, we can prevent people from downloading reports to PI data. We can prevent people from, we can make these class of objects discoverable and these not. And, we can tag all these elements. We can have people confirm that they understand a policy when they're like these are capabilities that you can support with technological solutions. And then there's some things you're asking for here that we just can't do, or they're so prohibitively expensive to do that it just doesn't make sense, or they're so constrictive. If you do this, you're basically meaning that taking this gold mine of resource that's available to the organization, you're saying you're not getting any value out of it, because that's effectively, you've locked it into the, you locked in the chest and buried it under the sand. And like, great, right? But so it's buried there, but nobody's
right.
What use is that treasure, right? So that's I think that's what we're seeing as well. Okay, well, let's go back and see if there's any. I think those were the key, the 7 we had, but I think there were lots of different questions here. So Laura, let's take a look and see if there's anything that we want to pick up here.
Sure.
It looks like there's one question here from Jeff about maybe you have some insight into this. They're getting C-suite to invest in tools. Is there a sequence of tools implementation that works best? Tools that the business looks, you can read it there. So what are your thoughts on that? Obviously, as you said, tools should come out only if and only if you have the overall objectives. Is there anything else you would add based on your experience as to kind of what you would sequence in the overall pipeline of different technologies? What do you think is the right steps for somebody starting out in their journey here?
Yeah, and that's a good question. I don't think there's a right answer, like a right or wrong answer in that case. The question really comes down to if you have a whole bunch of tools that already exist and you have to consolidate things versus net new scenarios in which you're purchasing and acquiring tools. So if you have a bunch of tools and you just have to figure out those tools and which ones work and which ones don't and all of that, then you do the assessment based on what you're trying to achieve. So you still start with that scope. You still think about what you want that data governance function to achieve, and then you look at the tools that you have and figure out which ones actually do that. And then you start to talk about what it means to decommission tools that don't meet those needs and deploying broader tools that do. Secondary to that, but it's the same kind of answer, right? If you're literally starting from scratch, you have no tools, start first with what you're trying to achieve, and then write up a set of RFPs, even if your company doesn't use the RFP process, which feels like a flaming hoop to me in most cases. But write up the process of thinking about what a tool is going to provide you in terms of answers and value add, and then look for that tool to meet those needs. I think in data governance, the tools that exist out there are data quality tools, or I'm sorry, data catalog tools that are really kind of part of the standard process now of data governance.
Yeah, I think those are all good points. The only thing I would add to that as a suggestion would be kind of think about this kind of as a two-phase process, in the sense that you're going to have accountability. You're going to go spend a bunch of money buying technology. That's obviously going to raise the expectation around value, right? So you want to have like that high-level strategic vision. So figure out, okay, what is my 3 or 4 or whatever 5-year plan, whatever my plan, longer term plan, what goals around governance, what you're trying to achieve with this program. And then, but also ask yourself the question, out of those set of objectives that I came up with, the reason I'm doing this governance, here's the key things. What is most important? Force yourself to stack rank those objectives in the near term. Right. So what is it that I want to looking at 6 months down the line, a year down the line? What is absolutely critical for us to accomplish? And that will help color the evaluation that you have to do, because you want to look, obviously, to set up a landscape of technologies that support your long-term goals, your 3-year plan in this area. But if you have some things that are absolutely critical today, then you can focus on that part of your technology stack that will make that happen, or focus, when you do the RFP process, on those particular vendors that have those capabilities today. Maybe they're not as fulfilled in other areas, and know that down the line, either those vendors will fill in those feature gaps, or you'll complement with other technologies, right? So you can't, like that. That's one other thing I would suggest. Okay, so I mean, there's a lot of questions here, but why don't you pick one pick one that you want to answer?
Yeah, there's actually several of these that I find interesting, but so there's a question here: how do you normalize multiple portions of an organization that have varying degrees of data maturity? Which is an interesting thing when we think about data governance, right? Because you are dealing with the entire organization, and you're always, like we've been talking about, get out there, do the value add, your job is communication. But if you have, and this is always true, if you have a part of your organization, finance is a great example, right? They live and breathe the data. They love it. The precision is incredibly important to them. Definitions should be consistent and shared and all of those kinds of things. And then, on the flip side of that, you have your sales organization that could not care two, what's about it. As long as they can do it quick, right? And then they get their commission sale reports at the end. So, what I would say, when you have those varying degrees of maturity in any organization, and that's true across most organizations, just respect where each of those are at, but rely on those organizations within your organization that have higher maturity to be your champions, right? They don't necessarily have to lead the way or anything like that, but if you could hook up a finance person with a salesperson so that they can have a conversation about why data is important, that's one less conversation you have to have, right? So respect where each of your departments are in terms of that maturity. Rely on some of your advanced departments to be champions for aspects of data governance, and that's really how change starts to happen. Don't focus on the people that are stuck or insist that it's wrong or it's never going to work, because you'll throw your energy into them all day long, right? Focus on the people that have enthusiasm, see the light and the value, and put all your time and energy into them, because then they're going to put their time and energy into other people, and that's how you spread that around.
Yeah, and I think that's spot on. And also the one other thing, I mean, we see this more in the BI governance aspect of the data itself, but oftentimes there's different business units and they have different levels of maturity around the metadata management and tagging and things of that nature. And what I see works, and I think this will work, whether it's just looking at data or you're looking at the BI tools themselves, set your minimum standard, right? Like the organization obviously should have some minimum standards, for example, all objects should be tagged with that PII data. They should have basic lineage, things like that, and set that at a level that you believe is achievable for the organization as a whole. Understanding that you can raise the bar over time, right? So, but that's everyone should meet. Everyone should meet that, but then enable capabilities for people to go above that, right? And make sure that you've got a program where they can, well, hey, if they've got a whole bunch of other metadata and they're more mature and they've got practices that are more mature, they can fold into a process that gives you sort of that plus above that. So think of it as like tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, or tier 1 plus, whatever that is, and design that way. And that way, even those folks that are kind of a little further behind, you can get compliance there. But those that are ahead, as Laura said, the ones that are cutting edge, they can lead the charge. And then over time, the rest of the organization can learn from them as to, what are the practices that work well. So, be flexible in that design.
Yeah.
Okay. So we have time for one more question. So there's probably like a dozen questions here. At least you get to pick the one question we're going to answer.
Oh man, I get to pick.
Yes. Why not?
Okay. So, well, I'll go with the very first one, which is from Anonymous. But the question was really around most data governance roles have the wrong job descriptions, not well aligned in the organization. The people that interview them isn't the right people either. How do you ensure a C-level commitment during the interview process and propose higher level data governance roles? So in other words, director, executive, or VP. Mm-hmm. And that's a really great sort of challenge for a lot of organizations. And I think this exists as well in data and analytics as a whole, where we're always struggling to push up that leader, up higher in the organization. We're trying to make sure that they have decent alignment. So I would say first and foremost, if you're struggling with that in your broader data and analytics functions, so your data and analytics leader isn't up at that executive level, if you're always having, interview panels that are either too business focused or too IT focused, both are problematic in this in this case. If you are, just ill-aligned overall organizationally, you're going to have that same problem from a governance perspective. So, there's really, by the way, none of these are magic bullets, right? The work is the work. It's you're pushing a rock up the hill, and then the next hill it goes down, and then you got to run and pick it back up again. I mean, that's just kind of the work. But in this case, I think when you have misalignment across your organization and you're struggling to get your executives to pay attention, one of the best things that you can do is create small iterative projects, proof of concepts or pilots that have a lot of value to your business users, whether that be your sales department or your finance department, as we were talking about earlier. That is sort of they're stuck on something and they can't quite get it because they're trying to, clean up a report, but the report's always messy and it's impacting their commissions, right? And then just make sure that when you start that project, that you're talking about it as a data governance effort. And as you continue to work on that effort, it's clear that it's a data governance effort. You don't claim credit after it's done, right? Because that nobody would believe you. And I think that's one way to try to infiltrate and make sure that people are clear what the value of data governance is. But second to that, it might start to help having organizational conversations for alignment. This is a problem in all over in a lot of organizations.
Okay, well, I think we will end with that. So thank you all for participating in this. Laura, I think we've been delightful to have you here. And so thank you so much for sharing your insight with us. And we will be sending out the recording to everyone. So thank you.
Awesome. Thank you. Bye.